Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Could I just do a quick show of hands, first of all? How many people here are working at startups, just quickly? And how many of you are focused on pushing towards profit now over the last 18 months or so? Yeah, okay, a lot of you. Thank you. We're living through what I think is a little bit of an end of an era. This is a graph of interest rates over the last 40 years or so. And you can see this period in yellow represents pretty much the last 13 years up until about 18 months ago, where most of the Western world has been in a situation where interest rates are near zero. That's created the conditions whereby investors are forced to seek out growth in ways other than just putting it in a money market account. Okay, so we've created the situation where there's been a huge appetite for investment in all sorts of things, and that includes fast growth tech companies where your money may be tied up for a long period of time and returns are uncertain, and some of these businesses could go bust. Over the last 18 months, as interest rates have picked back up, a lot of that investor appetite has evaporated. We've seen a lot of venture capital firms withdrawing in terms of the amount of money they're willing to deploy. And this has left a lot of startups, all the way from very small scale businesses up to some of the largest unicorns in the industry, scrambling to adapt to this new reality where they're not sure where their next funding round's coming from. And a lot of these businesses are reacting by trying to push towards profitability so they're no longer beholden to their investors. This can be seen very clearly in a chart that was published recently, some research that came out. Here you can look back at this key point. This is a graph of a selection of large US unicorns, their EBITDA margin, which is the sort of profitability divided by revenue. You can see this huge kink as the median of all of these tech companies pivots back towards saying we can't just keep burning money, we've got to get back to profitability. Okay? And you can see the consequence in terms of growth there. So this huge sea change is happening. The purpose of this talk is to share with you some ideas and some practical tips for how I think technology companies can execute this pivot. I'll put a caveat at the start. I'll say I've only been at _Wild for a few months. That business is actually in pretty rude health. And most of this experience relates to companies I've worked at more previously. But hopefully this will be, you'll find this interesting. The first question when you're thinking about trying to execute a pivot like this is, where should I start? Most people naturally think about, well, I need to get people building different things. I need to get people working on different projects. I think the first thing that you need to try and do as a leader is try and change people's perspectives as quickly as possible. You need to move from one mental model to another as fast as possible with a large number of people. And that means you need to focus on, first of all, on communication. If you think about it, going back to the first graph, it's entirely possible, if you're, say, under the age of 32, that you spent your whole career working in technology startups where money is cheap, it's easy to get the next funding round. Profitability might seem like almost like a lifestyle choice in some respects. So it's important to try and shake people out of that reality because the world has changed. So how do you go about doing that? Practically, one of the first things you need to think about is treating the logistics of all of this communication that you're going to have to drive into the organization as a project in its own right. So you need a plan and you need to be organized. You're going to have to do a lot of company talks. You're going to have to cascade information through line management structures. You're going to have lots of different one-to-one conversations. All of that choreography needs to be managed. And so you need to appoint someone who's going to organize everyone to execute this communication. A lot of people don't do this, and they end up as they lose time. You don't have time in this situation. Time is not your friend. When you get to the point of starting to communicate, you need to start with the why. Why are we doing this in the first place? There's a great book by Simon Sinek here that talks about this as a sort of philosophy for all your different kinds of communication. But it's really important that you tackle that fundamental complacency early on and talk about why you need to change. So the best way to do this is really to try and connect some of the things that people have been maybe reading about in the press, interest rate environments, how does that flow through the pipes of venture capital and end up affecting my startup business? So making those connections and being as candid as you can about the situation that your business is in. Once you're over that initial hump of communication, you need to keep up the commentary every month. Come rain or shine, good news or bad, you need to be up in front of your people communicating and explaining whether you're on track or not. If you fail to do this, you will leave a vacuum, and in that uncertainty will be filled with speculation, which will be even more challenging to manage than if you just got up and told them what the reality was, okay? One of the challenges during this period of pivoting is that it's easy to lose track of what the original mission of the business was. Every business exists to make money ultimately, but every business also has a mission, a reason to get out of bed in the morning. And if you bang the drum just about profitability all the time, you're in danger of losing the appeal, the motivational effect of your mission. So how do you combine these two concepts, especially when they're somewhat maybe antagonistic? The key construct, the key metaphor to use is that of a detour. We were planning to go from where we are straight to our mission. We can't take that route directly now. We have to go via profitability. And that is how we earn the right to actually go after our original mission. Okay? So communication is the foundation of getting the pivot underway. The second part, and the really critical part to get right, is how you manage the relationship between the finance team and the technology and product teams. When you get into this mode of focusing on a pivot that's very driven by a financial need, it's very likely that the CFO is going to assume a very strong leadership position in your organization. They're going to be the person on the field calling the shots. You're going to have to run a lot of decisions past the CFO, and they're going to need to understand your constraints, and you're going to need to understand their constraints very well. Okay, so it's important that you build this relationship, up and invest in it. It's very likely that at the outset of the pivot, the financial team will come up with a new financial plan. And that financial plan will satisfy the constraint that the cash burn at the end of this period will be getting to zero. But in order to do that, they will have to make some assumptions about how they can improve the unit economics whilst also potentially having to reduce some of the resources available to do it. Okay? And that's a reasonable first thing to do as a starting point. The question is, you as a technology leader, is how do you engage with that? So if you immediately just engage on the surface with this proposal, you're very likely to put yourself under an enormous stress, because you're going to frame the problem as which teams do I have to lose, which teams do I have to let go of in order to satisfy the plan, but also how am I going to achieve these outcomes in terms of driving the uplift in unit economics. And also, I haven't had the opportunity to put ideas on the table about other ideas about how we could make money and so on. So this is the wrong way to frame the problem. What you actually need to do at this point is take a step back and think about maybe why you're in this situation, and think about how you can proactively answer the question that's probably at the back of the CFO's mind, which is this one. And I don't know, I've been asked this question in every business that I've worked at. And if you think about it, the reason that this question gets asked is not because the finance team don't know what they're doing. It's because we as technology leaders often don't make much of an effort to actually explain it. Okay? So now you're in a situation where you need to explain this really, really quickly in order to make really good decisions. How are you going to do that? In my experience, the best way of trying to do this quickly is to use this construct almost of a shopping list. Okay? So we're going to break down the organization that we've got at the moment, and we're going to divide it up into tranches and say, this is what this block of people are all working. This is the business outcome that they're driving. This is the investment that you're going to need to make in order to keep that, to achieve that outcome. It's a very reductive process. It's very brutal, but you need to kind of start work on doing some of this stuff. The other construct that you need to use is this construct of zero-based budgeting. Normally, when you plan a new financial cycle, what you do is you start off planning your new budgeting period based on carrying forward all the expenses from the previous period as your starting point. And the default assumption is that you're still going to keep incurring all of those costs. Zero-based budgeting is a financing concept where you wipe the slate clean at the start of the financial cycle, and every cost that's coming in to the new planning period needs to re-justify itself. So everything comes back on the table, and you need to kind of re-propose why you're building this, why you're proposing having these teams. What that looks like in practice is something like this. Suppose you have a product and technology team of 100 people. You start building up these layers very quickly. What's the first thing that goes on the list? It's actually the operational overhead. This is almost a thought experiment that you do first of all. What is the minimum number of people that I could theoretically operate the current service at without backsliding, forget improving unit economics. What's the minimum number of people I need to keep the site running, update all of my dependencies all the time, stay compliant with legislation, fix bugs, fix security issues, release mobile apps, all of this stuff, okay? It's interesting when you often put this on the table. Often the mental model of finance teams is that this is probably just 3 or 4 people in the platform team. In practice, it often ends up being 20–30% of the organization. And this is a really interesting penny dropping moment with finance, because they realize that the floor is not where they thought it was, and the cuts that they're proposing actually take a lot more product development capacity out of the organization than they anticipated. And then you build up, right? So you add in all your additional layers and each sort of residual team, and you do this sort of very reductive, very crude thing of trying to map them to these business outcomes. Which of these teams are going to drive these different outcomes in your financial model, okay? You're going to have to pay the price of admission for the team in order to get the outcome. And then you have some management overhead on the top, which is probably some function of the overall organization that you're keeping. And maybe you're looking at changing the span of control for that management function a little bit, maybe taking some layers out. But that's broadly what you need to construct. And if you have this construct, then you can go back to the financial plan and engage in a much more productive, iterative process of refining the model and actually coming out with what is an achievable model. Okay? If you don't come out with an achievable model at the outset of the pivot, you're setting yourself up for dysfunction and higher risk of failure. Okay? So it's super important. So getting that relationship right with finance is really key. The final part is, how do you prioritize the work? How do you drive alignment into the organization? I don't think I need to spend much time explaining OKRs to this audience, but it is worth taking a moment to remind ourselves where it comes from. The reason OKRs are so popular now today is because they were the preferred management tool of a guy called Andy Grove, who was the CEO of Intel in the 1980s. And one of the reasons Andy Grove is so revered in the history of the technology industry is that he carried out one of the most famous pivots in the history of the technology industry, when he pivoted Intel from building memory chips to microprocessors in the space of a few years. People have compared that feat to something like Apple switching from selling phones to selling cars in the space of a couple of years, to give you some kind of framework. So the fact that he was able to use this tool to drive that change is one of the reasons why it's so popular today. So if you're maybe muddling through with OKRs, you're going through the motions, or it's not quite giving you everything you need, if you get into a situation where you need to pivot really quickly, it's worth doubling down on them, because they really come into their own in the situation where you've got to realign people very quickly. The other challenge is, how do we go about, within teams and within squads, prioritizing features by economic value? Now, under normal circumstances, we want to encourage product engineering teams to think holistically about the features that go into the products that they're building. You cannot distill every feature down to a profit and loss number. It's just not practical. It's not sensible to attempt it because you're solving a complex problem and you're trying to build a product that's more than just the sum of its parts. However, when you get into these kinds of situations where you're focused on just executing and trying to deliver a series of features in the optimal order, subject to the constraints of time and resource, you need to reach for more quantitative processes for how you sort your work. How do you prioritize? There's a whole bunch of different techniques out there. The one I think that is the most powerful and simple, and it seems to be very still underused, is this concept of cost of delay. And cost of delay is a very, very simple construct. What you do is you take all of your features that you've got in your backlog and you say, what is the cost today of me not having this feature in production? Okay, so don't talk about percentage uplifts, percentage that, some qualitative stuff. Money per month. How much is it costing me now not having this feature live? So the first column there gives you your cost of delay, and you would normally look at that and think, well, the highest priority feature is feature 1. Okay, I should build the feature with the highest cost of delay. But hold on a minute, all these things take different amounts of time to build. I have to weight that cost of delay by the amount of work it's going to take to build it. Okay, so very simply, you divide cost of delay by duration, and you get this score, cost of delay divided by duration. It's called CD3. And what it says is, the most sensible thing is to build feature 2 first, then feature 1, then feature 3. It's really simple. I don't think it needs to be the last word, but it's a very useful lens for your product teams to use to sanity check they're actually doing things in a sensible order. Okay? One of the other things that drops out of this kind of analysis is an expiry date. If you've got a very limited runway, there's going to come a point where it's not going to make economic sense to start work on a project because it's not going to deliver any economic value before you hit the end of your runway. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but what it means is you need to be mindful that when you're ordering things, there's a priority. You've got to get underway with certain kinds of features earlier than others. Okay? And this is also a useful, very simple mechanic that you can use. The last piece in this section is how do you think about the thorny issue of technical debt and technology investment when you're trying to carry out one of these pivots. What's the right thing to do? You've got to balance the long term and the short term. How do we manage this? I think the first thing I'd say is I see a lot of teams trying to do something like this, where teams end up getting fatigued by constantly negotiating between product and engineering teams about whether we should invest in this piece of technology investment, like building a new service to pull out of the monolith, or should we build some features? And they end up kind of agreeing this truce of saying, well, you can have 30% of your time doing technology investment and you can have 70% of the time doing features, right? Being generous, this is suboptimal at the best of times. When you are trying to drive growth and drive revenue very quickly, you cannot afford to operate like this. You've got to take these roadmaps and stitch them together and look at the dependencies between them. The justification for investing in a piece of technology, a pure piece of technology, a new service, is that it unlocks that you can build a new feature within the time available. You've got to be able to justify that investment within this runway period. Okay? And out of that analysis, you may discover that actually some of the things that you were planning to do are essentially a bridge to nowhere financially within this financial period. And then you do really have to ask yourself, is now the time to be making that investment, or should I defer? Okay? But those are the main things I think that you need to focus on. A few final thoughts to close. This type of pivot is really hard culturally. It's a big mindset change, and it takes a lot of effort to change your organizations. What I would say is that it will become a culture-defining moment. How you make decisions and how you communicate in these moments will last with your business for a lot longer than just the period that you're working in. If you do get through this period, people will remember how you operated and how you made decisions. It's incredibly important to treat people with dignity and respect, especially if you're having to do reductions in headcount. And I always say to people, make your decisions like you imagine you're on a stage with your entire company watching you. And that's a good mental model to be in, because in my experience, a lot of these decisions actually do come out in the wash after the fact. People learn about how decisions were made post hoc. And finally, although it can seem like a bit of a slog, it is a fantastic milestone in the business to get to profitability. You are no longer beholden to investment and the need to raise your next funding round, and you will have new levels of autonomy for how you run your business and make investment decisions. It's a much healthier place to be, and it can be the gateway to a much brighter future. So thanks very much for listening, and good luck.